We're live.
Okay,
Right, we are shifting gears and we're going to be hearing an introduction of H283 from Representative Leanne Harple. Welcome.
thank you. Are you ready for me to share my screen? Okay.
Probably the same in your committee, but many of us will have it up on our
Oh, okay,
devices
great.
as well.
Yes, okay. So I'm Leanne Harple, Representative Leanne Harple. I represent Orleans 4, which covers Albany, Craftsbury, Glover, and Greensboro. And I am here today to present about H283, which is a bill that I submitted on behalf of my constituents, which is a very big lake community, in order to give municipalities the right to decide whether or not wake boats should be allowed on their own lakes. Many of the towns that I represent have very small lakes and very residential lakes, where people have come to get away from sort of the hum and thrum of more urban life. And we have actually seen a few wake boats creeping into the waters as of late. So here are some things that we would like you to think about in regards to our bill. So the goal is to protect small inland lakes from environmental and safety threats. The wake boats create much larger wakes than just your typical motor boats that are already there. Most of our lakes already have prohibitions against jet skis, but not the wake boats. And so the purpose is to preserve ecological health, public safety, and responsible community use of lakes. Some of our thinking behind this are the environmental aspects of the way that they churn up the deep sediments, threatening the native fish and plant species. They also come with very large ballast tanks, and they can spread invasive species through that water. There are boat washes, but none of the industrial boat washes that really would do the job to prevent that kind of cross-contamination. It's more the zebra mussel larvae than the zebra mussels themselves, but that grows into the zebra mussels and Eurasian milfoil. And then shoreline erosion and water clarity degradation are sort of three main environmental problems that we have identified that these wake boats are causing. Another big thing about our lakes is that about our lakes and wake boats is that they disrupt our nesting loons and geese site and other waterfowl sites. Our ponds are an amazing place to hear the loons. I actually live on Lake Parker and can open up my bedroom window every night and hear the loons. It's been really wonderful. We have geese that have been coming there for my entire life. And our lake associations have worked really hard to protect all of these species, to protect the cross-contamination, and we're concerned that this is going to undo their work. It's not showing up, but one little piece I put here. Is it going to work? I don't know if it's going to work. Just for your own senses, these are the geese at my house. Oh, sorry, I forgot that I have to have my microphone. So you can't hear it on that, but you can check it later.
We can hear it over.
Okay, good. And so that's sort of the environment that I live on, and that are the concerns of the people that live on those lakes. You know, this is the Vermont that we really think that people are really coming here for. And we are saying that this is our Vermont, but at the same time, we're taking all these measures that are really eroding the little pieces of rural Vermont right now. And so this is one of them. Another part of this is that these are all mostly residential lakes. And we have a lot of children's camps. So for the last, I think it's been almost 30 years, I have worked at Glover Pioneer Day Camp, which is a camp that my family runs off of a piece of our land. We live on the oldest settlement in the town of Glover that was settled in 1802. And so we have the summer camp, and kids can come and dig in the cellar holes for archaeological fragments, and they go fishing, and they get to swim every day. And we go do environmental lessons at the end of Lake Parker. And my own kids have grown up fishing there. In this top picture, you'll see my sister and her dog and their paddleboard. And so these are just some of the kinds of things that become a little bit more dangerous and a little bit more disruptive when we have these huge wake boats. I think that perhaps there are places for them, but not on these little lakes. And so with this bill, this is something that towns could really know their own size, know their own capacity in the way that their towns use these lakes and make those decisions for themselves. So it's really quite a simple bill. It protects Vermont's rural character and small lakes. It balances recreation with conservation. It listens to local voices and values, and it creates thoughtful, enforceable framework for weight boat regulation. I know that you said I had 10 minutes. Yep, it looks like that's up. So I also submitted a letter to the ANR that I won't read to you because you have the text of it. But where this really came from was last fall when I first got elected, before I'd been sworn in. All of the lake associations band together when the ANR was collecting testimony. And I wrote a letter on their behalf. The ANR since then has not ruled on this, but we would like to move it forward with towns having this power. One question that continually arises is what would happen to a lake that was surrounded by multiple towns? First of all, this is really meant to protect the smaller lakes that really exist within towns. But in that case, I reached out to Ledge Council and they said that there are a couple options. Select boards from each town could band together and work together to come up with an agreement. You could have a municipal vote with all the towns on that. So that's something those towns would work out. But generally, those would be the bigger lakes anyway, because this is really meant to protect the smaller lakes within tiny little towns.
Question I was gonna ask.
Okay.
All right, Representative Austin.
Have you ever thought about just saying a certain size lake and a certain type of, vehicle? Because I'm on Mallett's Bay and I'm seeing some really new machines and boats and stuff like that. And instead of saying a wakeboard specifically, that to make it more for anything that's evolving that could disturb the shoreline,
Yeah.
just say on this size lake,
Yeah.
describe what it is as opposed to saying a wakeboard.
I mean, I think there are regulations with how large a lake has to be, but even with those, some people are feeling that those are not quite regulated enough. But we do, I would have to look more into that. There are regulations about certain types of vehicles. Like I know that in Glover, there are no jet skis allowed, which I don't really understand why jet skis aren't allowed, but wake boats are. I guess it's because we didn't have wake boats when we made the jet ski rule. But yeah, that would be a good direction to go in as well. I mean, I would basically support anything that would protect town's ability to do this, so that would be fine.
Right. Not make it so specific. So whatever, it's jet ski, wakeboard, if whatever it did,
Yeah.
that kind of disturbance to the
Right.
shore,
Yeah, I mean, we're not trying to ban any boat with a motor though. Like it is
Right,
possible
yeah.
to troll a small boat slowly through
Yeah,
waters
yeah.
and not create a disturbance.
All right, thank you. We're going to hear from Ledge Council on this as well, walking through it after.
Okay.
But if you have,
Well, I do have
go ahead.
just an observation to Sarita's comment about just legislative out. An international body such as Lake Champlain or Lake Memphremagog would not be monitored for that type of activity.
Right,
in my opinion.
right.
So you could not ban them there,
But you could say a lake, a certain size lake, you could,
correct?
could be banned.
That's already in the regulation, but it's not small.
Yes. This bill does not suggest trying to enforce this on international bodies of water or interstate bodies of water, both of which are actually huge enough that that wouldn't be a problem. The other thing that this bill does, I'll mention, is it gives the ANR the right to terminate this agreement if it doesn't work out. So this is really like an attempt to try this. Well, thank you.
It's just a
Right.
30-second.
We're getting behind.
And there's also Duke's Lakes. I live in a very lake.
And there are wake boats on them?
There's at least one on Parker. Yep.
So your interest is exclusively in banning wake boats?
My interest is exclusively in giving towns the authority to decide what is best for their town.
Thank you. Next up, we have Representative Lally. All right. We are going to hear H 453, an act relating to amending stormwater management to facilitate high-density development.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Kate Lally, representative from Shelburne. And this is a bill that is asking that the committee consider authorizing stormwater offsetting in designation zones. And the purpose would be to create opportunities for people to live in high-density housing while protecting the watershed. This would facilitate housing and development density and redevelopment in the right places. And I think it would align very advantageously with Acts 5947 and 181. It would provide locational efficiencies that would help with the provision of essential services, which would be water and wastewater, to, in places where that is currently available, make most efficient use of that, and in places where we might consider allowing that to be added to the fabric, make efficient use of that. It would also help inform where bicycle and pedestrian improvements could go, help with developing transit hubs, and the placement of EV charging infrastructure, all things that help to lower emissions from transportation. I think that more effective stormwater mitigation would also help with flood resilience. Decoupling stormwater from acreage promotes urban density and more compact urban footprints, and that can provide watershed level benefits for water quality and increased stormwater sequestration. And I'm envisioning places where I know you haven't gotten to developing river corridor regulations yet, but in locations where the goal is to move as far away from the river as possible, yet still allow urban development, this might help to inform the best use of locations that would be appropriate for development and encourage use of parcels that are perhaps closer to a river to be leveraged for their stormwater benefits that they might provide, which would then help with water quality and slowing down floods and things like that. So this is really an ounce of prevention approach, just encouraging you guys to think about density as a stormwater best management practice to help municipalities add housing and thoughtfully redevelop brownfields in ways that can avoid flood-related expenses and the lost revenue that can come from that. So I think this could also potentially help with avoiding situations where we have buyouts, which then result in those, if it's done through FEMA, the loss of those properties and the tax revenue. So it'd be sort of like scouting out ahead of time opportunities to thoughtfully and proactively develop better. And let's see. And if those properties happen to be publicly owned, those are sites that could expand recreation and walking and biking connections in communities. So to make this happen, we probably need to have stormwater ordinances and utilities. So perhaps models could be developed that would be that would help with that, you know, through RPCs and things. So it's just trying to take the land use reforms that we passed last biennium and sort of operationalize them in more effective ways. And in my neck of the woods, in Shelburne, one of the areas that would be just ripe for this kind of redevelopment is the Route 7 corridor, where we have a lot of outmoded sites, and they are, of course, parallels Lake Champlain, and it would be very helpful to redevelop certain of those locations as hubs for transit-oriented development. Would make it more affordable for us to provide transit in walkable and bikeable settings, but then it would also be an opportunity to use some of these larger sites, such as unfortunately our many car dealerships, to be used to manage stormwater. So so just a thought for how we can maximize the potential of the terrific reforms that we passed last biennium.
So your thought is that you could address your stormwater issues on another parcel in order to develop more densely on a particular parcel.
Correct. Just in these specific areas, consider whether it would be appropriate to decouple acreage-based stormwater and allow offsetting so that you could use the area that is appropriate to develop as efficiently as possible for actual building. And then places that were perhaps maybe within that designation zone that were maybe perhaps more marginal could then be used for stormwater management and remain undeveloped.
We might have gone this direction in our 3-acre bill. I don't know
Yeah.
about that. We think we did this.
Okay.
Well, there's a
study.
We're studying it. We're studying
Okay,
it.
okay, good. Okay, great. That's great. I just, I think, particularly in rural places, which, may end up with, soil-based systems, either on-site septic or community systems, the buildable land is going to be in limited supply. So, if we want to have density, we need to use it as wisely as possible, those opportunities. I'm trying to get away from car dependent suburban results that might, unintentionally emerge because we're sort of putting on-site management of stormwater on a par with on perhaps as high a par as buildings. So it just seems like something to think about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, good idea.
All set?
Yeah. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks.
I could also, Leanne's still in the room. I think she could be. We don't need Leanne Harple. All right. Representative Wozniak.
Hold on, Madam
A
Chair.
name I say every day. I do know it.
I think I'm glad to hear that. I don't know. Good afternoon, everyone. Representative Teddy Wozniak, Berry City. Thank you for taking the time to have me in today. And I'm here to talk about two bills, H 468 and 469, which are two short form bills. A little bit of table setting that these, first of all, do not reflect necessarily my wish list or Berry City specifically's wish list when it comes to flood response programs within state government. Both of these, while they would be, I think, beneficial to Berry City, were the amalgamation of work, the aggregation of work of hearing from members from flood impacted communities. When we asked what should be included in a flood omnibus bill, these were two pieces that we heard from members saying, like, this is what would help my town. So that is what's reflected in these two bills. These were originally, the longer form version of these bills were both originally in H 397, but were then stripped out. So they were reintroduced as short form bills to keep the conversation moving. And I appreciate you having that conversation today. So the first one, H 468, would basically require that the state establish programs to offer technical assistance to municipalities for planning flood resilient infrastructure, including roadwork adaptations and applying for federal and state infrastructure grants, as well as proposing support for specialized flood mitigation projects, including lifting or removing flood-prone bridges and removing dams that pose significant flood risks to nearby communities. Berry City we got hit twice in both 23 and 24, but looking at the statewide flood response, we are fortunate. We have a professional staff of over 100 municipal employees who can, do things such as write grants and pull data together and go through the various federal bureaucracies that exist when trying to get access to federal flood mitigation dollars. Other smaller towns, especially our neighbors in southern Vermont and in the Northeast Kingdom, don't have that kind of municipal infrastructure there. And a lot of EPA and FEMA programming and dollars are geared towards county government. So like thinking specifically about the South, North Carolina, Texas, et cetera, those are states that have very strong county government. And that's just not true in Vermont, for better or for worse. So we've heard from members that our more rural communities have a lot of difficulty accessing what is already a limited pot of federal supports. And there was an ask for the state to step up and help navigate those processes to get some of these resources down to our smaller and less resourced municipalities. And if you'll bear with me, I'll jump to H469 because they're both sort of a similar vibe, for lack of a better term. In H469, it would propose requiring the ANR to implement flood resiliency projects, including floodway creation, selective debris clearing from waterways, restoring flood retaining systems, supporting riverbank naturalization, and also allowing the agencies to expedite the permitting of cost-effective flood mitigation solutions. This section 2 came out of an observation that because of our lack of county government, the town-by-town approach to flood mitigation doesn't really work. Because you have to, what we do in Berry City in terms of flood mitigation will have an effect on those who are downriver of us. And just by nature of a municipality is supposed to take care of itself and govern itself when they don't necessarily have the resources or the expertise to look at the whole watershed. If we're going to do, a flood mitigation project in Berry, what does that mean for the folks downriver of us? And again, we are fortunate in the grand scheme of things as we've been able to hire river scientists to help us make those decisions. And we are being very conscious as we're making decisions, or I should say as the city council is making decisions about which projects to pursue. We are being very purposeful about not making things worse for our neighbors downriver. But again, a small municipality with a 3-person volunteer select board that has less than 1,000 people in the town, they don't necessarily have the time or the resources to get access to that kind of advice. And in absence of county government, believe it makes sense for ANR to take over that process, for lack of a better term. And I mean, I think that there would be a lot of details to work out as to what public engagement looks like, what parameters are set around ANR, what level of buy-in would be needed from the town. Would the municipal legislative body have to approve whatever ANR says? Or is ANR just given carte blanche authority to say, no, we've looked at it, we've looked at the watershed, this is what we're going to do, because we have that expertise and the municipalities might not. And on specifically the expediting of permitting of cost-effective flood mitigation solutions, you all understand this much better than I do, but in very layman's terms, after a significant flood event, the ground remains very wet for a very long time. And a smaller scale rainstorm that may not be, hugely impactful, all things being equal, could be hugely impactful if that smaller scale rainstorm comes a week after a disastrous flooding event. And so the thought, the request too, was to say, all right, if ANR sees a project that could have an immediate flood mitigation benefit, let's try to get that done as soon as possible before something else bad. It's one example being in Berry, we had, after the 24 floods, there was a very large tree, couple of very large trees on a riverbank behind one of our local businesses. And the ground was so wet after the flood, and one tree fell over, took most of the fence in the backyard of this business with them. And the business owner was sitting there trying to figure out whether to repair the backyard, repair the fence, etc. But there were these other large trees hanging over the riverbed that could go theoretically at any time. And in conversations with the city, and the city then with ANR, was talking about the permitting process and the time that would go through to get approval. Again, you all know these regulations much better than I do. But the business owner was stuck in a position of, do they do the expense to try to repair this work if A&R is eventually going to come in and do something to that waterway, do something to that riverbed, do something to those trees. So that was the thought behind giving A&R the ability to say, like, yes, we see this. Let's just do it now before it gets worse. So those are some of the eyeball ideas, I think, that are represented in these two pieces of legislation. And there's obviously a lot more work in detail that would have to be put into this to make them valuable options. But I think that they reflect both our larger municipalities, like especially our smaller municipalities, saying, we can't do this by ourselves. We need more state support from A&R to be able to make our watersheds work for all of us.
Yeah, thank you. Do members have questions? Representative Levy.
Thank you. Why were these two pieces stripped out of other legislation?
So the H397 was put together as a flood omnibus bill, and that it impacted the Division of Emergency Management, A&R, VTrans, et cetera. And the meat of it, though, was governance and the Division of Emergency Management. So House Gov Ops, when they passed 397 out, more or less decided that they were going to focus on the governance pieces and the DEM pieces, and frankly, in order to meet crossover deadlines, rather than having to go through, I think it was up to 8 committees at one point, strip some of those pieces out because they just didn't have time to get to them this year. So those pieces that were stripped out were reintroduced as short form bills to keep the conversation going.
And did you consider locating this responsibility at the RPC level? Or reason state level? We don't have county government, obviously, but we do have resources that are sub-state, larger than municipal.
Yes, I think that RPCs are obviously indefinitely larger than individual municipalities, but still may not oversee an entire watershed. And I think that we have learned that it needs to be a whole watershed approach, because we've learned what they do in Waterbury affects us in Barry and affects us in Plainfield and then Linden. And so we felt that A&R and the state were the right ones to have that watershed wide expertise rather than, and I will also say that RPCs, the capacity of RPCs vary across the state. We have some very high functioning, very professionalized RPCs, and then we have some others that may not be as well resourced or as active. So again, we thought it made sense to put that at the state level rather than RPC.
Representative Austin.
Have you talked to A&R about this proposal?
I specifically have.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Much appreciated.
So glad you're here, Michael. Please join us. I invited Legislative Council to help us frame at least the two preceding the non-flood bills and the issues they bring up. Particular 283 and what it covers and what it would be, and then updates on conversation around wake boats and framing the topic broadly to help us understand it.
Sure. Okay. So this is Michael Grady with Legislative Council. The surface waters of the state are held in public trust for use of all citizens. And the state is the public trustees. The General Assembly is the one that technically holds the trust. You've delegated to A&R the authority to manage the public trust. And one of the ways that you've delegated that authority is you given the agency the authority to regulate the use of waters of the state. The waters of the state generally are navigable waters, except for private ponds, which is hard to. There used to be a great definition for this program, but it's not anymore. But basically 20 acres or less, and it's surrounded entirely by one private owner. That's a private pond. So, and it doesn't include transboundary waters, And it doesn't include the Connecticut because the Connecticut isn't in Vermont. But it does include the reservoirs off the Connecticut that are in Vermont. So A&R has a use of waters rule. But part of the statute that you gave them, and you can see this in H-283, where you delegated to them, is the last subsection, the language that's being amended by the bill. Currently, the secretary is authorized to delegate the regulation of public waters to a municipality that is adjacent to or which contains the water. And the municipality, when they accept delegation, have to create a bylaw or ordinance for the regulation of the water. And the agency, has done that for a couple of waters, most recently for the Newport Harborage. They delegated to Newport the ability to manage basically harboring in the Newport Harbor. Newport has an ordinance, but there's also a memorandum of agreement between the agency and Newport, and that was done in 2023. Now, with regard to this is specifically about wake boats. And wake boats have been a pretty contentious issue over the last 2 to 4 years. And it's in part because at the top of page 3 of H-283, A&R and their regulation of the use of waters is supposed to attempt to manage the public water so that the various uses may be enjoyed in a reasonable manner in the best interest of all the citizens. To the extent possible, the secretary shall provide for all normal uses. So they're supposed to manage the waters for various uses. And the question has become is something in normal use? Like back when jet skis first were proliferating, are they a normal use? And at times they were determined not to be. And then at times that they were determined to be. And that's why when you look at the use of waters rule, what you'll see is a list of most of the lakes in the state, most of the big lakes in the state. And there will be specific restrictions for some of those lakes. Representative Harple noted that Glover doesn't allow jet skis, and that's because the use of waters rules prohibits personal watercraft on Shadow and on Parker. And so that was done by A&R.
It's not the town doing it.
It's not the town that did that. It was A&R that did that. When the wake boat issue came up, A&R went through a pretty involved rulemaking process. There were multiple interested parties. They tried to meet their statutory responsibility of balancing and allowing for various uses, allowing for normal uses. What ultimately they adopted was authorizing the use of wake boats, wake sports on 30 lakes. So there are 223 lakes that are bigger than 20 acres in the state. And so 30 lakes have the wake sport zone, and there is specific requirements for what a wake sport zone has to be. So it's an area of a water body that has a minimum of 50 contiguous acres that are at least 500 feet from shore on all sides, that are at least 20 feet deep and at least 200 feet wide, located on a pond, lake, or reservoir, which is listed, where vessels with internal combustion motors are allowed, and may be used at speeds exceeding 5 miles per hour. So that criteria significantly limited the number of lakes where wake boats could be used. And there are just 30. They're listed in Appendix E of the use of waters rule. But that didn't stop the opposition to them. There are still people that want to oppose them or oppose them outright, or as Rep. Harple would like to do, to give municipalities the authority to regulate them. I think that that's an option, that's a policy option. I wouldn't say that there's anything that legally requires you to do that. But you can set up the statute to allow for delegation to a municipality. I would do it a little bit differently than that's what's done in the bill. I would maintain the discretionary delegation for any municipality, because right now it's the secretary may delegate for the regulation of public waters, and that's how Newport and that's how Colchester have their authority. But this changes it to a shall. The secretary shall delegate, and it's only when the municipality requests a delegation to promote the public good by restricting wake boats. So this was provided by an attorney that was working with this association, and he's a fairly high profile attorney, and I pushed back a little bit, but I wasn't going to push back too much. But I would have done this differently.
Does this go beyond the delegation of the authority to limit wake boats? Does this obligate the town to do more?
It could be read that way, right? It could be read as delegating everything, or it could just be read as delegating for wake boat. It just needs to be rewritten. There's nothing wrong with the policy, but the mechanics of it it's not good. And so I would basically create another subdivision where you would have the existing language be its existing subdivision, and then another subdivision where you would address delegation for management of wake boats. And then it'd be clear about what the delegation was for. It wouldn't be about all uses. The town couldn't like ban paddle boards. And so I would just mechanically change this if you wanted to go forward with the policy. But it's definitely something that you could do if you wanted to do it. It would only affect those towns bordering the 30 lakes. The way that A&R has addressed those issues with multiple municipalities, they've done it in different ways. It's usually they get to control that part of the water that's within their municipality. But that doesn't work for some of the smaller or weird multi-jurisdictional lakes like Iroquois, where you just have like that little bit that like hooks into not Heinsberg, not Williston.
Not Williston.
Most of Iroquois in most.
It's the
St. George.
Yes, St. George. So they could probably work through Lake Association in that instance where the association was approved by all the municipalities to do it. I mean, they have options.
Can you say again, so there's 30 lakes where it's allowed, 220 lakes greater than some amount?
I think it's 220 lakes that are greater than 20 acres.
But the wake sports allowed thing was 50 acres.
50 acres. And so there's over 800 lakes in the state, about 823. 220 are over 20 acres. But the wake sport zone can only be on those lakes 50 acres or more. And so there's a list of the total lake area of all of the lakes that were approved for wake sport zones. Throw a lake at me and I'll tell you how many acres.
Holland Pond,
Hmm?
Holland Oh,
329 acres, and its wake sport zone is 90.2. The biggest one is Bombazine. It's 2,415 total lake acres with its wake sport zone area above 1,000 acres. And the smallest is Shadow. No, Sunset in Benson. That's 205 acres with a 74 acre wake sport zone. But it's also interesting, the size of the lake doesn't always dictate the size of the wake sports zone. For example, Waterbury Res, that's 869 acres total, but only 56 is available for wake sport.
Right, you have to be a certain distance from the shore.
And a certain, did you say a certain depth too?
Depth is based on depth too.
So this is a detailed map that boaters are using when they're deciding when to rev up their wake boat?
No, it's just like where you ski on lakes, water ski. There's areas that are marked for usage. Usually by a buoy or four.
Questions? I'm curious what, I think the Senate, are they taking this up this week? Or what is happening in wake boats?
I have not been asked to go in on wake boats in the Senate. I spend a lot of time on wake boats.
I don't want to lose your expertise on wake boats. We don't want you to forget. Okay, well, and then it seems like for any further questions on 283 wake boats? For 453, I think we kind of covered that in our stormwater bill.
Yeah, the one thing that about that bill that didn't come up in stormwater bill is that the stormwater management manual is kind of old or getting old. It was last enacted and adopted by rule in 2016, 2017. Its effective date was 2017. And you have since adopted you've adopted land use regulations that encourage higher density of development. And is the existing stormwater management manual sufficient to address those concerns? I do think that that's a realistic question. Does the manual need to be revised to allow for more alternative techniques? Which Lally references some that are EPA resources, but you probably might want to look outside of the EPA because of, think of all the high density development all across the country that are dealing with stormwater issues. You probably have options for review. So that is, I think, one thing that you didn't discuss with your 3-acre bill, which is a legit question.
Yeah, finding out when the next update to the stormwater manual would be a good thing to know. Okay.
Just a question on that precedes my time here, the stormwater manual. Is that something that we control, or is that something that DEC control? Who's responsible for managing?
They do it by rule, I believe, and so they manage it.
Okay,
So,
it's not something we do.
yeah.
So they started it on their own when the state started managing stormwater in 2004. You directed them to adopt it by rule. So it was more of a transparent, open process. And they've revised it 2007, 2015, 2017, I think. It's that time frame.
Do we need to direct them to update it, or is that just something that they do on updating this?
Well, I think Michael's posed a really good point, so we should just check in with them, see where they're at with their updates and make sure they're taking into account changes to land use.
Nothing we necessarily need to do with legislation, just wait that.
I don't,
So generally, the agency has like a 5-year review of rules to see if things need to be updated. Because sometimes they don't need to be updated, you know, why amend the encroachment rule when it's pretty much set, like, but the Vermont water quality standards have to be adopted, revised every 3 years, and solid waste rules are kind of on a pretty, it should be every 5 years, but that takes a while. I mean, they try to do it regularly. On this one, I don't know the manual. I think they have a 5-year cycle, but you might want to check with them. And if they have a 5-year cycle, then they've already.
further questions for Michael? Thank you. That completes our items. Oh,
So I was in House of Probes for 2:30. They did vote it out. They voted, I think it was 9-2. Rep Harrison raised the question of whether or not the striking the compensation for deer and bear damage had been reviewed by House Agriculture. Which I said, to my knowledge, it had not. And so the chair of Approps asked the speaker to have House Ag look at it, but I don't know what time frame.
yeah, so we did hear from a couple of farmers on it, is what I remember about the ag questions. Okay, thank you. The update. All right, with that, we are adjourned.